There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of Barbara Pym's novel An Academic Question, written in the early 1970s and put aside and published posthumously in 1986 by some accounts, 1987 in others. Barbara Pym died in 1980. I have been reading Barbara Pym's novels in publication order for about 3 years now, and this is this penultimate one. This was a buddy read with Ange of Beyond the Pages. I have buddy read several Barbara Pym novels with her in the past couple of years, and the buddy read was a delight. So you guys know that Barbara Pym is my favorite writer. If I had to pick one, it would be Barbara Pym. 4 of her novels are among my most favorite novels of all time, and those, because I know you're going to ask in the comments section, are her debut, Some Tame Gazelle, A Glass of Blessings, No Fond Return of Love, and most recently, the last novel I read by her, isn't that right? Crampton Hodnett. Those 4. So you need to sit down for this next bit, because I absolutely hated this novel. This is one of the worst novels I've ever read. And no disrespect to Barbara Pym. Barbara Pym worked on this in the 1970s. If you know her history, and I'm about to tell you, she had some very successful novels published starting from 1950 going to 1961, and then her publisher, Jonathan Cape, rejected the manuscript of An Unsuitable Attachment, and Barbara Pym was sent into the literary wilderness until about 1977. She had several novels rejected, one after the other, not only from her regular publisher, I said Punisher, Freudian slip, her regular publisher, Jonathan Cape, but several other publishing houses. She just fell out of fashion. And she wrote this manuscript in the 1970s, and she got advice from her best friend, who she only met once, many years later, the poet Philip Larkin, and he gave her advice on it. She thought her style was still too old-fashioned, so she gussied it up to make it more modern, and then decided, no, this is not going anywhere, and she set it aside. She thought, oh, maybe my friends would like to read it, and I think considered sending copies to her friends, but she knew that it was no good. She knew it wasn't publishable. Her literary executor, Hazel Holt, also her friend and co-worker for decades, certainly many years, at the African Institute, where Barbara had a full-time job for decades. Holt's biography, which I have read and is quite a good biography of Barbara Pym, is called A Lot to Ask. Hazel Holt was also her literary executor, and she, who became a kind of mystery novelist or something, took it upon herself to finish the manuscript, put it together, and get it published posthumously. And I will never forgive Hazel Holt for doing that. So this is not so much of a review of this book, because it really is awful, as it is a rant about when writers die and they have stuff unpublished, you shouldn't publish it. Certainly if you know, based on diaries, journals, or letters, that they didn't think it was fit for publication. It's a crime against literature. This is a crime against Barbara Pym's oeuvre. It was just awful. I'm going to rip it to shreds now, but it's all because I want to give Barbara Pym a hug from beyond the grave and say how mean that Hazel Holt was to publish this. You knew it was no good. So she tried to modernize it, and so the protagonist is an unhappily married young woman, Caro, whose husband is an anthropology professor or something, and it's pretty much a loveless marriage with a kid, a young, 5 years old or something. Kate, who she is so absent. I mean, if you've read Barbara Pym, you've never read about any children. There's no children in Barbara Pym, and she certainly didn't draw this little girl well. She might as well not have been in the story. Didn't get a sense of her at all. But that's true of all of the characters. So there's the theme of infidelity and also academic theft in the story. The academic theft narrative is really boring, and so is the tale of infidelity. It's like you can just see the writer, and again, I am very forgiving because she didn't want it to be published. She knew it was no good, so please let me continue to tear it to shreds. Every development in the story, and it's a very plotty novel for Barbara Pym, a lot happens, but every little turn in the plot, you could just feel Barbara Pym coming up to a little bit of a wall and then backing up and going in another direction and then coming up. So nothing is developed, nothing is really resolved. The emotional dynamics of the story are non-existent. And my biggest complaint, the biggest absence is there is no humor. I couldn't believe that as much as many of these characters seemed like the very rough drafts of Pymmian characters, that none of them were funny. There was no wit. It was devoid of wit. It shouldn't have been published. Did I mention it shouldn't have been published? There were only two passages in the whole book that struck me as being Pymmian sentences or Pymmian passages. So I'll share those with you because you just definitely don't want to read this book because it shouldn't have been published. One is from early in the book, and this sentence didn't quite land. It's a bit of dialogue, but it was 3/4 of the way towards being pithy Pymmian prose. Wherever you go, you take yourself with you, she said, and that is too upsetting in beautiful surroundings. So, yeah, that's pretty good. And then near the end, also dialogue. The protagonist and her husband are entertaining a professor or somebody at their home, and he uses the word data in conversation with her husband, and she interjects. Such a funny word, data. I rushed into the conversation. I always imagine them as little dark things, aggressively plural, and woe betide anyone who forgets it, like nails or cloves. Isn't it better to say material? Material sounds like an amorphous thing, homespun woolen or folk weave rather than exquisite brocade or silk. Now that is the Pymmian voice. That is something that would come out of the mouth of a Barbara Pym character. There is absolutely nothing else in here that does. So Hazel Holt, shame on you. That reminds me of the egregious mistake that was made in publishing Harper Lee's debut novel, Go Set a Watchman. This is as bad. Now, there's some racial problems in this novel, too, and let's be honest, as sweet of a person as Barbara Pym was, and as wonderful as her writing is, when Africans show up in her fiction, it's she had a bit of an issue. She was racist. Probably less than many people of her day, but there's a little bit of that. That's beside the point, really, because it was just such a flawed manuscript, and that's why she set it aside. So, let me conclude with something I haven't said before. This shouldn't have been published. And then I will say, please read anything else she's written. Now, I have one more that was also published posthumously, but I believe she wrote it in the 1930s. So I'm hoping it might go better, but maybe it won't. You must try Barbara Pym, and so Some Tame Gazelle. A Glass of Blessings, No Fond Return of Love, Crampton Hodnett. Many people think Excellent Women is her best novel. I didn't like it as much as those other four, but it was also very good. But don't start here, and I would say don't even bother ending with an academic question. You will regret it. Barbara, I love you. Hazel Holt, you're on my shit list. Thanks for watching.